Rael?
Hi, Rael Khan. Rabbi, I've got a question on medicine for Shabbos.
Sorry.
Medicine for Shabbos, yeah.
If you have to take a pill that's in a blister pack, and it's got a foil on the back of the blister pack, are you allowed to tear that to have your pill?
The issue is the writing on the foil. I just had it this last week. I had to get a pull out a blister pack for somebody. We're not supposed to break writing on Shabbos. And usually on the foil there's like a logo or writing.
Inevitably.
Yeah, inevitably. The best is to ask a non-Jew to take it out for you, to pop it out or pop it out before Shabbos. Look, in an extreme case, a person's not well. Or
Are you allowed to cut the other side of it?
yeah, and you're not cutting the writing. The best is to try and get it out without breaking it.
Preparation before Shabbos.
That's the...
What happens
That's the key. That's the key. You have to prepare. If you're going to eat chips, you have to open it before Shabbos.
You're not supposed to break writing on Shabbos. And that's important also to know with whiskies, because sometimes at the top of the label there's writing. So you've got to take a fork or something and try to get the whole piece of plastic off. Or if it's something that like signs through the lid or whatever. Yeah.
How big spell in Canada, huh?
Always explain to my wife before Shabbos.
Really, you cut writing.
If you got the cake.
If it's got a...
If you got the cake. I'm sure
I connected this evening to the service. Then in Pretoria, I was loading up to when I arrived.
Also with margarine.
Oh no, you can smell it. It smells outside.
Because
it smells inside.
okay, that's fair. I mean, why
really? Okay.
outside, why should inside not have the leather?
It didn't service it well. I have to take it.
Are we ready to roll, everybody?
Ready to roll.
Okay.
Just get our place.
Does it say the participants?
I'll begin with the regular.
Nick and my question. How old are you? And 19.
Shimon, how are you keeping?
Are we ready to roll? Gentlemen? L'chaim, l'chaim. L'chaim, everybody.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov. Do we have in mind anybody this evening? Anybody that we have to have in mind in our studies?
I know that my dad's 26 of Tammuz, but it's still a long way.
26 of Tammuz. Okay, about 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks.
Yeah.
Tanya Bat
Margalit.
Margalit.
My father.
For a for Shlema.
Yeah.
For a for Shlema. Please God for Shlema.
And Dov Bear ben Sarah Sonia.
Dov Bear ben Sarah Sonia.
He's a very special friend of mine in Nightbegun. And one more, first of all, Eliyahu Raphael ben Phoebe.
Eliyahu Raphael ben Phoebe. For a for Shlema.
Mama Chutten.
Yeah.
And this lady that
Please God for good stuff.
Teacher, who never ever came round. She's still in ICU for months.
Ashley's in hospital. I didn't know. I didn't know.
Sorry?
So Rabbi, they had treating for her at the Morningside Clinic, and they changed the name to Chaya Bacher. Bacher, now it's Chaya.
Chaya El Bacher. Okay. Has everyone got a place in the various different Gemorahs? You've got a place. Melech Salkandaris, Salkandaris. In the page. Melech Salkandaris. Here we go. Almost at the Mishnah. Melech Salkandarit, anybody need a place? Do you need a place in our scroll?
Where is it?
I've got a place here.
Salkandarit Salt, or Melech Salkandarit. You see it? 39b. 39b, Melech Salkandarit. We're talking about a special kind of salt called Salkandarit salt.
Shall we offer the wife of the
of the Chaver. It can get mentioned again. It may be mentioned again because No.
So she's still around though.
Sorry? She's still around, but on a different page. Are we ready? Okay, so the Gemorah continues to unpack the various items that were listed in the Mishnah. We're actually coming to the end of this Mishnah. Just to remind everybody that the format of Gemorah is such that you have a Mishnah. The Mishnah came from an earlier age of sages, the Tanaim, and the Gemorah is like the commentary and explanations on the Mishnah, and sometimes it can go on as it did here for quite a few pages. We actually coming to the end of this particular Mishnah. We probably will finish this particular Mishnah in the next few minutes tonight. The main subject matter of that Mishnah was to list a whole bunch of foods, a whole host of foods, that if produced by a Gentile, a Jew may not just buy them. In other words, they're questionable. And as we've said many times, that contrary to today's day and age, where people tend to go to the supermarket and find everything on the shelf, and hopefully there's a good hechsher, a good mark, a certification mark. In those days, a lot was based in those days on home industry. People made stuff at home. The people who made stuff at home were the experts. You had the baker guy and the butchery guy and the guy that pickled the olives and the cucumbers and the man that had the beehives and the honey. Everybody did their thing. And the people that did their thing were not necessarily Jewish. There were Gentiles and there were Jews. And based on the fact that the Gemorah had said that certain products that come from Gentiles cannot be bought, they cannot be considered reliable or consumed, sometimes not even allowed, not just for food consumption, but even with a Isur Hana, with a prohibition to have any benefit whatsoever, that you couldn't even use it to feed your staff or anybody else that you had to feed. And this list was the list that there was in the Gemorah. Remember, we spoke about a spice called chiltis and a fish paste called chilak, which was like little sardines, and fish brine and fish stew. And now we're coming to the close of that list. One of the last things that was mentioned on the list was melach salkundaris, salt. Now we know to this day and age that people make salt into all kinds of their flavored salts and their herb salts. I think I mentioned last week already, there's that Swiss brand called Vogel that makes a salt called Herbemer, where they prepare the salt together with herbs. I think that one has some kind of foreign hechsher. And the different salts that people make, which are flavored and put together with other spices. And in those days, there were also types of salt that were made with proteins, like with gravies or dried powder or fish stew or whatever it might be. The Mishnah referred to a certain type of salt called melach salkundarit. The commentaries on the Gemorah are not 100% sure, as the Gemorah itself, as to precisely what kind of salt this was. However, what we know is that the Mishnah said that this is not a kosher item. It's not an item that you can willy-nilly buy from a Gentile and use it in your house as one of your ingredients. So the Gemorah wants to know what it is and what the problem is. Says the Gemorah, melach salkundaris, my melach salkundaris. What is salkundaris salt? And in fact, this very word, salkundaris, there actually know people that have the surname almost like Salkandar. But the interesting thing about it is that this was a phrase that was utilized a lot in those days. But even if one looks at Rashi and the different Mefarshim, it's not very clear what this particular phrase means. Some people say that it means the dignitaries in Rome, like the princes and the dignitaries, and we're referring to kinds of foods that they would utilize, which are more choshev, more important than other foods. Then there's an opinion that the Salkandara were actually the bakers, the people who organized the confection for everybody else, the challah and the biscuits and the good food for everybody else. And then there was another opinion that there was the Salkandaris was a type of salt, a recipe for salt. So what is the melach salkandaris, the salkandaris salt that you can't use? So the Gemorah says it's a machloikas, there's a difference of opinion. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said, quoting the sage Shmuel, melach Shekol Sakundari Reimi Eichlin Oisa. We're talking about a salt that the distinguished nobility of Rome use it. You want to know what this is? Go to the grocery cupboard in the high distinguished Romans that have fancy ingredients. You know, they're the guys that maybe buy their ingredients in Traps or one of these fancy places. Go into their cupboards and you're going to find not ordinary salt but salkandari salt. This is what we're talking about. A special kind of seasoned salt that the aristocrats tend to have in their grocery cupboard. And then furthermore on this the rabbis taught that this was, by way of introduction, a kind of salt which was flavored, funnily enough, with parts of the fish. Inside the fish you get the insides, the intestines, which have like some kind of, it sounds almost a little bit like an anchovy kind of flavor, a strong fish flavor. And they would take this, the insides of some type of strong fish, and they would use it to flavor the salt. And the dried fish and the salt became a mixture called salkandari salt. Based on that, there were different colors. There was salkandari salt that was black, and there was salkandari salt that was white, depending obviously on the ingredient that was put inside it. And now you have a difference of opinion whether the black one is kosher and the white one is kosher, or both not kosher. And that's what's happening now. Tani Rabban and the rabbis taught melach salkandari shchayra asura. The rabbis taught salkandari salt, the black variety was prohibited. Levana muteres, the white variety was permitted. And now you're going to get the opposite opinion coming. Devrei Rabbi Meir. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says other way around. Levana asura, if you get salkandari salt and it's white, that's the one that's treif, that's not allowed. Shchayra, the black version of salkandari salt, muteret, is permissible, is allowed. Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel, Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, third opinion, Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel says, quoting Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, Oimer Zuvazu Asura, both this variety as well as that variety are all prohibited. So basically what we've now learned is that there's a black colored salkandari salt and there's a white colored salkandari salt, and according to one opinion the black one's allowed but the white one not, and another opinion says vice versa, and a third opinion says all salkandari salt is not allowed, whether it is white or black in its color. Then the Gemorah discusses what's the reason, what is the reason that one type of salkandari salt would be good or not good. Omar Rabba Bar Bar Chana Omar Rabbi Yechanan. Rabba Bar Bar Chana taught in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Ladevrei ha'omer, according to the opinion that says Lavana Asura, that white salkandari salt is not kosher. You know why? Kirvat dogim lavanim temayim muravin ba, because the innards of non-kosher white fish are mixed in that kind of salt. Ladivrei Omer, according to the opinion who says Shchayra Asura, the black variety is prohibited. Kirva Dogim Shchayrim Temei Muravin Ba, is because the innards, the intestines of black fish, which are not kosher or not pure, are mixed inside it. So what Rabbi Bar Bar Chana is explaining, that what you have over here is a recipe where they put the fish brine or the innards of the fish in this salkandari salt, and according to one view there was non-kosher fish which was white in its color that was mixed in the salt, and that's why they outlawed the white salt. And there's another view that said there was black colored non-kosher fish innards put in the salt, and that's why they outlawed the black salt. And then there was an opinion that said that whether white, whether black, they were putting the innards of fish of both colors into the salt, and any salkandari salt, whether the dark variety, the light variety, all no good. According to the opinion that says both this color as well as that color are all prohibited, not kosher, it's because their view is that all goes by the recipe. According to them, the culture, the tradition was, those that made the salt were mixing in non-kosher fish innards, non-kosher fish intestines of both colors. That is the Gemorah's explanation, all of this until now, as to why the Tanoim in the Mishnah did not want us to use salkandari salt. Because whether it was one color, whether it was all colors, the bottom line is that the people would mix the fish innards into it, and it was fish innards from fish that were not kosher. But then the Gemorah says, anecdotally, you should know there's another reason not to use secondary salt. There was also a habit of the Gentiles to put pig's fat in the secondary salt. And in fact, there's a story which backs up this concept. Omar Rabbi Abo Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. Rabbi Abo said in the name of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, Zaken Echad Haya Bishchuna Seinu, there was a particular elderly fellow in our neighborhood, Shehaya Machlik Ponea B'Shuman Chazir, who would smoothen out the surface of the secondary salt with the fat of a pig. In other words, when they made it, when they produced it, part of his recipe or his style was he would take pig fat from a chaza, and he would use it to smoothen out the surface. Apparently that made the product more appealing, I suppose, everywhere except in the kosher market.
How many manufacturers were there of salt?
Sorry? So these were private people, but they weren't manufacturers. This was very much home industry, but they went by a thing called a chazaka, by a formula. And the general trend was that most of the people were doing this. In other words, halacha is based on probability. The probability of occurrence was that this is how they prepared the salt. This was the recipe, and this was the way it was done. What you'll find later on in the Gemorah is the halacha, and we're actually going to see that quite clearly, is the halacha will differ if something specific happens as opposed to something that's assumed or probable. In other words, generally the rabbis will say that if wine that came from a Gentile source got mixed in, you may not use such and such a product. But interestingly, and we're going to see that soon, the Mishnah said, but it's not asur bahana, which means you can have benefit from it. You may not eat it, but you can have benefit from it. But then later on somebody says, I think it's Chizkiah, we're going to get there, hold on a second, that's if we're working on probability, that's generally the recipe, and that's generally what they do. Do we know for sure? We don't know for sure, we never checked it. But if you know absolutely for sure that a particular non-Jew or somebody who knew him came to you and said, we definitely put Yain Nesach in there, then it's much stricter. Then you may not even have hana'ah, you may not even have benefit from it, as the Gemorah will say afterwards. Then we get, this is the last piece of the Gemorah that unpacks or explains here that Mishnah. And the Gemorah wants to say here, I could actually flash it back to the Mishnah, but basically just to give everybody an idea of what happened at the Mishnah that we had, because it was quite a while ago, a few pages back, it did an interesting thing. It sandwiched the list between two proclamations of prohibited. The Mishnah started out by saying that these items that come from Gentiles are not allowed, asurin, and then if you remember it started a whole list which we've been going through over pages. Boiled vegetables that were boiled by Gentiles who might have put wine in, and as we said, that sharp herb called chiltit which they might have cut with a non-kosher knife, and this and that and that and that, and a fish brine and this. And then right at the end of the Mishnah we got the last part of the list, which we just were learning about now, the secondary salt. And then, interestingly, the Mishnah ended off by like closing the brackets, Hare Eilu Asur, and these are all prohibited. The question is, why do we need to hear that these are prohibited twice? Meaning, once is enough. They said at the beginning of the Mishnah, I'm going to list all items that are prohibited. That all items that are prohibited. You've listed the items. Now, why does the Mishnah have to close off? By the way, these are all prohibited. Now, our Tanoim, and this is a general rule in Torah, nothing is for nothing. Not a word, not a dot, not a phrase is just their stum. So the Gemorah wants to know, what is the extra lesson that the authors of that Mishnah, the Tanoim of that Mishnah, intended by closing off the list by repeating that these things are prohibited? Normally that creates, in as we said, in the study of Torah, and it's the same thing in Chumash, in Gemorah, there's a thing called a mi'ut, which means an exclusion. Sometimes, sometimes things are learnt out, sometimes things are learnt out by exclusion. You want a cup? We got a few over here. Sometimes things are learnt out by what they call an exclusion. If a Mishnah says that there are these things which are in this category, and you see that it's being categorized very specifically, what you're learning is that something's being excluded. You know, if somebody sits here and says, I've got 5 friends, you're going to worry, are you one of the 5? Maybe he's only got 5 friends. If the Gemorah says, Arba Oves Nazikin, there are 4 main fundamental main categories of damage, of the laws of damages, the first thing that's going to happen in such a discussion in Gemorah is what's not in that list, what's excluded from the laws of damages. So if a Mishnah ends off and says, Hare Eilu Asurim, these are the prohibited things that you can't purchase from a Gentile, our question is going to be, what is excluded from that list? What's not part of the prohibited list? Hare Eilu Asurim, back in the words of the Gemorah, these are prohibited. Asks the Gemorah. The Gemorah asks a question, to exclude what? What's being left out of this list? So the Gemorah says, according to Chizkiah, it's coming to exclude the case, as we just spoke a moment ago, of something that we know specifically was tainted with Yain Nesach, with the wine of Gentiles. We have to bear in mind that the Isur from the Torah prohibition of wine that may have been used by Gentiles or made by Gentiles for their libations, for their idolatrous service, which is the intrinsic meaning of what Yain Nesach means. When we talk about Yain Nesach, which literally means wine poured for idolatrous libations, essentially we're referring to wine that was utilized by Gentiles for their idolatrous practices or made for that purpose. It's a religious winery. They're making wine for service in their temples, not for drinking at a dinner party. And therefore, such wine is actually what we call Osur Midoraisa. There's a Torah prohibition against using such wine. Not only a rabbinic prohibition, a Torah prohibition. But if the wine was not specifically made for that purpose, or we don't know, that was a decree, as we said, of Chazal, of the rabbis. We don't know specifically. And therefore we had said over here in this Mishnah that wine from Gentiles could affect any of the foods in the Mishnah. The reason why boiled vegetables, for instance, couldn't be bought from Gentiles, just taking one item that was in the Mishnah that we learnt about, is because the trend was that they used to pour wine in their boiled vegetables. It was a very common ingredient that if they sold boiled vegetables that they had boiled or pickled or whatever it was, 9 times out of 10 wine was an ingredient. Whose wine? Their wine. Their wine that the rabbis...
Where is it mentioned in the Torah?
Sorry?
Where is it mentioned in the Torah?
Mentioned in the Torah.
Yain Nesach.
The Yain Nesach mentioned in the Torah. So it's mentioned here in the Gemorah. The Torah tells us, which the rabbis extract from the words in the Torah, that the things that they use for their service become prohibited to us. So when they started using their wine in order to serve their idolatrous things, it became prohibited for you and I, for us.
Yeah, but...
what exactly are the verses? We could find them. If you go into the places where, if you go into the places where it talks about that gezerah, that decree, it will quote the exact pesukim, the exact verses, So basically, for instance, one example would be that we weren't allowed to use meish lokos, their vegetable... had their boiled vegetable water and their boiled vegetables because it generally had wine inside it. But the Mishnah also said don't eat it, but you know what? You can use it for hanol, for benefit. You can trade with it, you can sell it to somebody and make a profit. You can feed it to your staff or use it for any other benefits you have. If you have, I don't know, if that particular lotion or potion will work for a shampoo or for a topical ointment, you can use it. You can benefit. The only thing you cannot do, there's no isur hana, there's no prohibition on benefit. The prohibition that exists is consumption, is eating it. However, Chizkiah says that if you don't know for sure, if you're working only on probability, but if you know that the guy definitely put his wine into those vegetables because he tells you that that's how I do it, in my recipe is my favorite wine estate, the kranz or whatever it is, and I pour it in my veg. now that you know for sure the wine is in there is an Isur Hana. Not just a prohibition of achila, of eating, but there's also a prohibition of Hana. According to Chizkiah, this is the reason that the Mishnah ended off with that framing phrase, these are prohibited, to stress these where you generally don't know if there's wine or not. But others where you know for sure, B'yadua, that there's wine in there, that's stricter. There is a Isur Hana.
How can you trust any food that involves cooking?
Sorry?
Involves cooking, meaning that you mix different spices, different things that's made by a non-Jew.
So we're able to
rely
run.
on it.
Okay. So we're able to rely. In today's day and age, we run, thank God, on a very high level.
But
In those days, that's how people lived. They bought things from those who made them, and Halacha said that certain things that they made you're allowed to use, and certain things you can't. Like for instance, in the next Mishnah, when we get to the next Mishnah, it won't be mostly tonight, but probably next year. The next Mishnah is going to talk about what you are allowed to buy from the Goyim. And it talks about things like honey's in the list that you are allowed to buy from them.
No insects will come close to honey.
Sorry?
No insect will not come close to honey.
They may.
Because they know it's specifically for bees. And obviously they don't go near it, generally.
What happens if they put in a container that's not kosher?
So I think the container would be a separate issue to the container would be a separate issue to the stuff itself, and then also it would depend when it was put. Was it cooked in the container, put in cold? It might not be affected if it's put in a cold container. Le Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, le meuta murais. The exclusion over here was to exclude murais. We spoke about it a few times, which is fish stew. There was a common fish stew that they used to make. Ugvinas beisun yaki, and there was a particular kind of cheese, which was called the cheese of the house of Unyaki. You know, like you can have, I don't know what, a famous family that has a very, a renowned name for making a particular kind of food or dish, because they have for generations had the recipe. So you might hear of, I don't know what, I think there's actually a, I don't think it's kosher, but there's a Bandino's butter or something in this country that some of the gourmet caterers use. So Gvinas Beis Unyaki was a non-Jewish family called Unyaki, and they had a tradition of making cheese. But their cheese was known to have wine as an ingredient. And because of that, it was outlawed, it was prohibited. And Rabbi Yochanan wants to say that in that list in the Mishnah of whatever it was, 12 items, 14 items, 2 have to be extracted, and that's the cheese of Beis Unyaki and the fish stew, because these will always have wine, not sometimes, but always. You know, they weigh it up based on probability, but probability also increases when something's in the recipe for sure. Like most omelets do have egg in them. If something, jokes aside, if something has very clearly got a certain ingredient, like you know for sure, I think any monkey gland sauce is going to have chutney, I think, in it. Is that right? Yeah. So if you know for sure that something is going to have a certain ingredient in it, it's not a maybe. It's part of that particular, it's like if it's a wine sauce, it's going to have wine in it. So the idea is that, yes, it's true that you've got a list of 12 to 14 items that are produced by Gentiles, which we're saying there's a probability of sorts that there's going to be non-kosher wine or non-kosher ingredients in it, or non-kosher fish in it. But Rabbi Yochanan says, and therefore we took a view that there's no prohibition on hana and benefits, but take out of that list 2 items, which is the Gvinas Beis Unyaki, the Unyaki family's cheese, and the fish stew, which will always have wine in them, that's just the standard. They are not going to be free of an Isur Hana, of a prohibition on benefits. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, that was the reason for those words at the end, Hare Elu Asurin, these are prohibited. And then the last 2 words of this Gemorah, on this Mishnah, was Stamaka Rabbi Meir. The Gemorah quotes a general formula that you've got a lot of Tanas, that's authors in the time of the Mishnah, So the the sages in the time of the Mishnah were called Tanoim. And what's interesting, sometimes you read a Mishnah and it tells you who's saying it, like we're saying here. Rabbi Yochanan says this, and this one says that. In some cases, it's an unauthored piece. It doesn't say who says it. And the Gemorah is quoting the general rule, Stamaka Rabbi Meir. An unauthored Mishnah is generally Rabbi Meir. So that would apply in the case of our Mishnah too. That because it's an Stam usually means ordinary, but ordinary, no Mishnah is ordinary. Ordinary in the sense that it doesn't have a quoted author. So the parts of our Mishnah which don't say that this is Rabban Gamliel or this is Rabbi Yehuda, you should know Stamaka Rabbi Meir is the quotation of Rabbi Meir.
So you worked very hard, Rabbi Meir.
Yeah, he did.
He's dead.
He did.
Did they sleep at night, these two?
Yeah. They did. And then what I'll do, I'm just going to read a few lines into the next Mishnah. The next, and then we're going to cut. We're going to cut in a few minutes in case anybody wants to ask anything. Masnisi in the next Mishnah says the next Mishnah is almost symmetrical to the last one. The last Mishnah had said these are the things you can't buy from a Gentile or use from a Gentile. This Mishnah does the opposite. And here we go is the source of what we call Chalav Yisrael, milk that comes from either a Jew or a Jew's supervision. These are permissible to eat. Milk that was milked by a non-Jew, and a Jew saw, a Jew watched or supervised a non-Jew milking a kosher animal. That's what's called Chalav Yisrael. V'hadvash and honey. V'hadavdavaniot. Davdavaniot, in this case, there's a machloikus between whether it means grapes or in this case, in this Mishnah translation, what is it in modern Hebrew? Cherries. Cherries. Yeah. But in the language of the Mishnah, you can have differences in the colloquial usage of words. In the language of the Mishnah, according to the commentaries on this Mishnah, we're either talking about grapes and the juice that's oozing out of the grapes, or we could be talking about honeycomb and the honey that's oozing off the honeycomb. So v'hadavdavaniot, and in this case grapes, even though they are dripping, ein bohen mishum hechshe mashka, don't have what's called the susceptibility of liquid. And we'll discuss what that means when we unpack this piece by piece. Uchvashin she'ein darkan laseis laseichen yayin, and liquids that, or you could call it gravies or vegetable gravies, that are not usually with an addition of wine. You know, you can have different recipes. There were vegetable mixes that were prone to have wine as an ingredient, and there were vegetable mixtures that weren't prone to have wine as an ingredient, so those were allowed. V'chometz and vinegar. Sorry, Sha'in Darkon Nasis Asechan Yain V'chometz, I put the comment in the wrong place. Those kinds of vegetable broths that were of the type of recipe that the Gentiles generally did not put wine or wine-based vinegar into them, those are okay. V'tarit Sha'ina Trufa, and the tarit fish that's not minced. Remember we had said that a tarit fish that is like a patay or minced wasn't allowed because nobody could see what kind of fish it is. But if it's not minced to such a degree that you can actually see what kind of fish it is, then it's not a problem. V'tzir sheyesh badaga, and then you could have also tzir, a brine that you actually see the fish, like sometimes they make a fish brine, and you can actually see descriptive pieces of fish in the brine, B-R-I-N-E, not B-R-A-I. V'ale shel chiltis, and the leaves of the chiltis plant. We said before that the actual root or whatever you want to call it, the chiltis itself was too sharp, and if they'd cut it, they could make it non-kosher with their knife. But the leaves are okay, even if they come from Gentiles. V'zeisei gluskois hamagulgalin. And then there was a special kind of olive cake. They're very ripe and soft olives they're called rolled olive cakes. Yeah, I think we'll stop over there, and we'll continue next week. We can chat a lot. We can chat a bit, but we'll stop over there, and we'll continue with this Mishnah, which talks about those items that we are allowed to buy from the Gentiles.
Can I ask a question about
Certainly.
fish eggs, or is that not?
Fish? No, fish you can. With pleasure. Caviar. Yeah.
Is that kosher?
It depends if the fish is kosher. I think if the fish is kosher, the fish eggs are kosher, and if not, no. Yeah.
So salmon is okay.
Just like if the chicken is kosher, so is his eggs. By the way, there's only 2 examples. Let's see if you know what they are. Where there is a food product from an, call it a creature, animal, person, whatever, and the creature's not kosher, but the bee. The bees are not kosher, but honey's kosher. You know what else? Humans are not kosher, and their milk is kosher for their children, even for others. Chalav Isha is kosher. But if you're a cannibal, you're not allowed to eat kosher teeth.
So you say, sorry, Rob?
Yeah.
You say, sorry, a woman's milk.
Yeah, it's kosher.
But if she's eating pork?
Sorry?
If she eats pork?
I don't think that would affect the kashrut of the milk. Spiritually, it would be a problem. But the milk is not affected, I think, by what the person
what the body is produced.
That's what the body produces. Yeah. If, for instance, if somebody feeds something non-kosher to a cow, I don't think that would affect his milk, her milk. If you know that a cow was fed something not kosher, I don't think that would affect the milk of the cow once it goes to that cow. In fact, if a kosher fish swallows a non-kosher fish, it's fine. So if you want to eat a crab, get one of your big buddies to swallow him.
This law of not benefit with things of not the Jew, not the Gentile. But today we can see the China,
Where we used to walk around
Chinese, those are feeding, making clothes, and the people they buy. Sometimes you have a business like in the Tekalot or whatever. Now you buy from China, you benefit from that.
I wouldn't say you can't benefit from anything. We're talking about specific things. This was about the food. The food that's not kosher, the food that's kosher, you can benefit from. If they sell you vegetables that don't have a inside, if they sell you bread that's kosher, if they sell you anything that's kosher, you can benefit from.
Coffee.
Coffee is a good example.
The family that you say there was not a Jew. The family that you say there was not a Jew, but the rabbi there, and now they are to be eaten.
Because they trusted them. There were certain families that were trusted. They had earned their reputation that they wouldn't add the wrong thing into the food.
That family they are selling out the
I don't know, they could have sold it to everybody. Time everybody. It's good to see you guys.
When did you come in? We're waiting for you.
When you going to see what you do tomorrow? In the morning.
I'm studying with Lava Mike.
Rabbi Levi? Do you see Rabbi Levi tomorrow?
No, he attended the
And you'll be
not as went as infantry. So he ended up being sent to the
Rabbi Levi come in the morning. He's not there.
We were just saying that. It's an exception, but the truth is, I think what I once heard, honey actually doesn't come from bees. Honey is collected by bees. Honey is a nectar that bees collect. They don't produce honey. They collect honey. Yeah, it doesn't come from their bodies. They do have an ability to assemble it. But they label it, exactly. They take it, sweet nectar, assemble it as twice.
Where does the honey come from?
The flowers, the blossoms.
When you went nectar.
The nectar. But still, one could ask the question that is a bodily, it is produced somehow. You could say that the tree allows it, and that's it. Then we have to see that from the
Yeah, you got to see that. I know.
Just so, good cover. Just so.
Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha Omer Ratzah Kodesh Baruch Hu L'Zakei Zes Yisrael Lefikach Chiba Lahem Ter Mitzvahs Shenemar Avnei Chofetz L'man Zimanoya.
I just think guys will get tongue tied.
Amen.